Very delighted to be here from Canada today. As Canadians, we like to think of ourselves as friendly and welcomed around the world. But to be honest, it's been a couple rather difficult years on the international stage for Canada. The situation has changed in terms of technology and geostrategic instability. And I think in the Canadian case, rather surprisingly, a lot of it links back to cybersecurity and what's happening in terms of the cybersecurity approach by Canada, which as a middle power is starting to show a few cracks, unfortunately. And I think it's an interesting case study for middle powers in the current situation. First off, there are more players in the space. We're starting to see a reduction in national security as a community leading the discussion in Canada on what happens with cybersecurity, and an increase in the legal community and what's happening in business legal cases defining what is happening in terms of the direction of cybersecurity. Also, the professionalization of tech professionals themselves has changed the dialogue. In many cases, they view themselves as separate from the national security community and are less willing to take direction from the national security community in some cases. So these new players, for example, cyber lawyers, cybersecurity lawyers, regulators, insurance providers, are developing, but not always in the same direction. For example, for breach reporting, regulators and the insurance providers have different expectations and different processes are triggered when you report it to them. It's making it a bit complicated. And additionally, the population has certain expectations for technology, including 5G, that may not be the same as the national security community itself. Second of all, unfortunately, Canada being between the US, China, Europe, and other parts of the world where we're trying to trade and do business, is a bit late to the table. We have not developed our directives or legal framework to the same extent or as proactively as, for example, the EU has with GDPR. And we're finding that other regions of the world have been more proactive and earlier to the table than we have. For example, with the EU and UK more focused on privacy, not just with GDPR, but the Network and Internet Security Directive. Russia is very international law focused. A lot of people don't realize President Putin has a degree and wrote a thesis on international law, particularly the Russian doctrine of international law. On most favored nation trading status. And other areas like, the US is very business focused right now in terms of what's happening with cybersecurity direction and laws. And India is also moving towards a very privacy focus. China, interestingly, and a little bit out of sync with the direction Canada is taking a very state approach, but with an international breakout and expansion. And this includes Huawei. A lot of people don't realize what Huawei means, but translated, it means China can achieve. Hua, China, Wei can achieve. This was their breakout brand of getting away from taking IP from other countries, in a sense, and developing something from the ground up. When this went to market, it's receiving some friction and pushback, which was very disappointing and is not likely to go away anytime soon. They are the 72nd largest brand globally, according to Forbes. This variation across the cybersecurity legal and regulatory landscape is getting baked in. What we're starting to see is that while there is no international law for cyber, it's appearing in trade law, international investment law, but the domestic legislation, executive orders, for example, in the US, rules are changing in countries that are taking on, in some ways, the characteristics of the current leadership. There's so much demand to do something immediately to regulate the space or to legislate within the space that the laws are actually taking on a snapshot in time For example, in the United States, Public Law 11522 from 2017 rolls back privacy protections for consumers, and net neutrality was rolled back, very business friendly. President Putin, again from a very international law basis, in 2000, Russia requires that all of their foreign policy considers international law, again from a very Russian perspective, the Chernyshenko school in particular. What a lot of people don't realize is that before they moved into Crimea in 2014, Russia obtained a legal assessment which found that they were on solid footing. Of course, this was disputed by many countries, but that kind of process is developing into their structures very clearly. What we are seeing, too, on the international law front, again, no cyber law, but we are starting to see it in international investment and trade as a factor, is that countries are less satisfied with the dispute resolution mechanisms available. And the international law community is starting to report a return to gunboat diplomacy. And I don't say this in any way tritely, but international affairs is becoming more politicized, and we're starting to see the ones and twos, a very low-level taking of individuals or attacks on individuals. We have 2 Canadians in detention. Canada currently is holding the CFO of Huawei. We see it again with the Russian law in 2006 for extrajudicial killings, where President Putin can order extrajudicial killings in the state interest, according to their law, right after Litvinenko was attacked, Skripal, more recently Zelem Kongashvili in the heart of Berlin just a couple months ago. We're also seeing Khashoggi. So we're starting to see this not just within the legal community, but even in real terms, a low-level kind of aggression creeping in. Canada also doesn't have again, as a middle power, you wouldn't expect it to have a grand strategy. But within the cyberspace, this is becoming more important over time. And grand strategy, what does it require? Greater than military action in peacetime and in domestic space. And that clearly is cybersecurity and cyber interests. The Russian approach is one of what Frederick Westerland is calling strategic solitude, and they are more than happy to go it alone. Unlike NATO, unlike coalitions of the willing, or the EU, for example, Russia is fully building into their doctrine, their military doctrine, their national security strategy, and their laws, the ability to go it alone. And from what they are considering a defensive position in response to NATO, which of course most Western states are looking at as the reverse, Russian aggression, but within Russian doctrine and their military documents and even their laws, they see themselves as responding defensively and with hybrid and reflexive kinetic capability mixed in with cyber. What I found particularly interesting was the May 2019 implementation of the Internet Isolation Law in Russia, whereby they can actually unplug their internet system from the global internet. This goes even beyond the cyber realm, and it goes into the financial sector as well. So if there are attacks in the financial sector, Russia, whether by design or by accident, does not have a global systemically important bank. And by that, it will not go down as dominoes back into Russia should there be a response. As General Alexander mentioned, we are responding reactively. Russia's already preparing for the blowback into the country in response. So what to do if Canada is a middle power and doesn't have a grand strategy that can handle this kind of instability and complexity within the environment? Canada is also going it alone in a certain sense, in a different direction than Russia, not strategic solitude. But Canada is working very hard to sign on to even more multilateral agreements We signed on to the new NAFTA, and it's being ratified at this time, CETA in Europe, the CPTPP in the Pacific, and they're even trying to move into Mercosur in South America. This, however, while it gives the government some protection from dispute settlement and the costs of it, unfortunately is not leaving a lot of room for maneuverability for the businesses who have to navigate all of these different agreements, particularly in terms of cyber. And with the USMCA, which is the new NAFTA agreement, it's already affecting how one of our provinces, Quebec, keeps data. They used to have to keep it within Quebec or Canada. That is now one of the clauses that has changed with these international agreements. So quite difficult. And the last point I'd like to just touch on briefly is that a lot of the areas that Canada's looking at right now in its cyber approach are perhaps symptoms and not the core problems. For example, 5G is probably more of the problem with countries across the world being compressed onto a single backbone or platform, despite the national security concerns, despite the dual use of the technology, which can be for good or bad. And we see this with the drone swarming capabilities. We see it with the cryptocurrency capabilities that may be enhanced with the AI moving forward, and countless other applications, despite the utility of the 5G potential. We see already with the drones that the military applications and 124 people saved from drowning off the coast of Australia and Brazil already. Another potential symptom, rather than a problem, we're starting to see problems with investment into the tech and cyber sectors in Canada. And this may reflect that the environment is too unstable. We don't have the laws solidified, particularly Canada, a bit late to the table. We don't have the technology, will always be changing even more rapidly. And it's hard for investors to actually put their money into something that's changing so quickly and has so much uncertainty into it. Add on the geostrategic problems. During our election, 110 cybersecurity and tech companies came forward together asking the government for assistance in an open letter during the election, which was a big surprise to many people. Plus, the accelerator and incubator model to developing companies within this space is a bit tricky, because if you're developing a company based on price and how much you can earn from this company in terms of stock value, for example, you don't really need to understand the risks or the business of cyber. And perhaps too many companies aren't scaling up because it's the quick invention, the quick discovery, the quick sell-off, but you don't really understand the business or how it affects the rest of the economy or the risks associated with it. And just closing out, another symptom may be the risk management itself within the cyberspace. According to the new discipline, cybersecurity economics, we're starting to see cracks in how risk management functions within the cyberspace. It is not functioning as it does for traditional security. And we're starting to see this across the different strategies. And just finally, because I see we're out of time and we have another prestigious panel coming up, risk tolerances. It is very difficult to get our arms around what the risk tolerance of the government versus the people versus businesses are within the cybersecurity space. As a quick example, in the San Bernardino terror attack, as well as the Toronto car ramming that recently occurred, the devices of the attackers were encrypted. The population did not support de-encryption because they favored the privacy, even though, unfortunately, there were 14 and 10 deaths, respectively. And so these kinds of surprising risk tolerance variations, not very well understood yet. So on a more optimistic note, I think if we look at having a proper strategy, trying to stabilize the space as best we can in such a dynamic environment, and trying to better understand what is a symptom and what is the core of the problem, we may be able to smooth this out as a middle power in this new environment. Thank you very much.